People said a lot of things about Jedodiah Cain. They said he hadn't slept a full night since the winter of 1879. They said he'd killed a man with his bare hands out on the Yellowstone Flats. They said he'd been a soldier, a spy, a government man, and something worse than all three put together. They said he went up into the mountains because no one in the valley wanted him there anymore. They said Crow's Bend was better off without him. Some of that was true, some of it wasn't. Most people never bothered sorting one from the other. In a small town, a comfortable story is worth more than an accurate one. And the story of Jedodiah Cain had been keeping people warm on cold evenings for years. But here is what they never told you. Not one single soul in Crow's Bend ever told you about the woman who stepped off the Billings stagecoach on that sweltering August afternoon in 1882. Not one person told you what she said to him in those first 30 seconds. Not one person explained what happened up on that mountain over the months that followed, or why the snow that fell that particular March was different from any snow those hills had ever seen before. They didn't tell you because they didn't know. What I'm about to tell you, I know. So settle in. The fire's going. The night's got nowhere to be. And neither do you. The stagecoach from Billings rolled into Crow's Bend on a morning so hot the air itself seemed to be breathing heavy. Dust kicked up behind the wheels and hung like smoke over the street. The wooden sidewalks filled with people. Not because anything remarkable happened in Crow's Bend, on most days it didn't, but because word had spread fast the way it always does in a town that size. Jedodiah Cain was coming down from the mountain, and he was coming down to collect his mail-order bride. Now the town had been chewing on that piece of news for 2 solid weeks. 43 years the man had lived alone. 43 years of cold shoulders and hard silences, and a reputation that kept sensible people from asking too many questions. And then one morning a letter arrived at the Crow's Bend post office, addressed to the Hartfield Marriage Agency back east, signed in handwriting as blunt and stripped down as the man himself. J. Cain, mountain man, seeking a wife, can provide shelter, food, honest work. That was the entire letter. No pleasantries, no description of himself, no mention of what kind of woman he was hoping to find. Just the facts the way Jed Cain did everything bare to the bone, nothing extra. So when the stagecoach door swung open that August morning, every soul on those sidewalks leaned forward at once. What came out was not what any of them had pictured. She was small, not fragile, small, not breakable small, but compact and deliberate the way a well-made knife is small. She stood perhaps 5 feet in worn brown boots, her calico dress faded from too many washings, her travel bonnet slightly askew from the long ride. She had hair the color of autumn leaves dried out in the sun, reddish-brown, pinned up fast the way a woman pins her hair when she's done it in a moving coach without a mirror. She stepped down from that stagecoach like she owned the street. She didn't look at the crowd first. She looked at the mountains. She stood there for a moment, those pale blue eyes moving from peak to peak, taking in the scale of everything she had traveled 2,000 miles to find. Then she looked at the crowd, and the crowd looked back. Here's the thing that nobody in Crow's Bend quite knew how to account for afterward. She didn't look like a woman arriving somewhere new and uncertain. She looked like a woman arriving somewhere she had already decided to stay. Jedodiah Cain stood beside his horse at the far edge of the street. He was tall in the way that mountain men tend to be, not just in height, but in the particular stillness that comes from years of living in wide-open spaces. Broad shoulders, dark hair going gray at the temples, 3 weeks of beard on his jaw, hands like 2 slabs of carved hickory hanging easy at his sides. He wore no expression worth describing. He watched the woman step down from the coach the way a man watches weather move in over a ridge, noting it, measuring it, waiting to see what it carried. He looked her over once, head to toe, fast and thorough. He looked away. Now something happened in that moment that not a single person on those sidewalks caught. I caught it because I was watching him, not her. When she reached for the iron rail to steady herself on the last step, her hand, just for one brief instant, maybe 2 seconds, no more, trembled. Not from cold, not from fear. From the particular kind of exhaustion that lives in the body of someone who has been working very hard for a very long time to look completely fine. Jed Cain saw it. His jaw shifted, just slightly, the way a man's jaw shifts when he has filed something away where he can find it later. Then he stepped forward. "Miss Rixley?" His voice came out rough as gravel road. "That's me." Her voice carried clear and strong across the August morning. "I expect I'm not quite what you pictured." There was something in her tone, not apology, not nervousness, something closer to a challenge offered plainly, as if she had said, "Here is the truth of the matter, and you may do with it what you like." He didn't answer. He picked up her trunk, loaded it on the wagon with a single clean motion. "Wagon's this way." She followed, but before she took 3 steps, an old woman appeared from the edge of the crowd. She was Crow people, ancient and small as a child, with a single white braid and eyes black as creek water at midnight. Her name was Bessa Ironwood, and she had lived at the edge of Crow's Bend for longer than anyone could clearly remember. She moved through the crowd without touching anyone, stopped directly in front of Daphne. Rixley reached into her coat and pressed a small cloth bundle firmly into the woman's hand, said nothing, gave one nod, was gone. Daphne looked at the bundle, looked up, looked at the empty space where the old woman had been. Jed had seen the exchange. He stood by the wagon holding the reins, watching. His expression didn't change, but the set of his jaw had shifted again. Daphne tucked the bundle into her coat pocket, walked to the wagon, did not ask for help climbing up. She gripped the sideboard, put her boot on the wheel spoke, and lifted herself onto the bench with the clean efficiency of a woman who had never once waited for a hand she wasn't certain was coming. She settled herself, straightened her bonnet, folded her hands in her lap. Jed climbed up on the other side. He took the reins. The horse moved forward. Crow's Bend watched them go. And not one single person standing on those sidewalks had any idea what was about to happen up on that mountain. Not one. They had the story already sewn up and labeled in their minds. A sick woman, a hard man, a bad match, maybe dead before spring. That was the story they told themselves. This is the real one. The road out of Crow's Bend ran east along a dry creek bed before it began to climb. For the first mile it was still a proper road-packed, dirt wagon-rutted, the kind of road that connected one piece of civilization to another. After that first mile it became something else entirely. The pines moved in close on both sides. The road narrowed to little more than a trail. The sounds of town fell away behind them, the blacksmith, the dogs' voices calling back and forth between storefronts. All of it gone, replaced by wind through pine needles and the slow, steady rhythm of the horses' hooves on dry ground. Daphne Rixley looked around the way she had looked at the mountains earlier, not nervously, carefully, like someone taking inventory of a new place they intended to understand. Jed drove and said nothing. A mile passed, then 2. The silence between them had a particular quality, not the comfortable silence of people who know each other well, but the thick, loaded silence of 2 people who have not yet agreed on the terms. "Beautiful country," she said finally. He said nothing. "The letter mentioned you raise cattle." She kept her tone easy, conversational. "How many head?" Silence. "I make a decent apple pie if you've got the fixings." Nothing. She turned slightly on the bench and studied his profile. Square jaw, eyes fixed straight ahead, a muscle moving slowly at the side of his face working something over. "Do you talk?" she said. "Or is this simply how it's going to be?" He glanced at her sideways. "I talk when there's something worth saying. And whether I make apple pie isn't worth saying." "Not particularly." She nodded as if filing this away under useful information. "Fair enough." She turned back to the road. The pines continued their slow procession past the wagon. The mountain grew larger ahead of them. The air was cooler up here, cleaner, with a sharp edge to it that was nothing like anything Philadelphia had ever offered. Another stretch of silence passed, then she tried again. "What are those trees called?" She pointed to the tall pines lining the trail. He glanced at them. "Ponderosa pine. You know all the trees up here." "I live in them." "Of course." She said it without any edge, just acknowledgement. "What about that one?" She pointed to a broader tree further up the slope, darker bark, wide-spreading branches. He looked. Douglas fir. And that one? A brief pause. Aspen. She nodded. I like aspens. He didn't ask why, but he hadn't stopped answering either, which was something worth noting. They stopped once halfway up where a narrow creek crossed the trail. The horse needed water. Jed wrapped the reins and climbed down and stood by the animal without acknowledging Daphne at all. She climbed down herself, walked to the creek's edge, crouched down and took off one glove, pressed her bare hand into the water. Cold, clean, fast-moving over smooth stones. She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out the cloth bundle Bessa Ironwood had pressed into her palm back in town. She unfolded it carefully. Inside were several bundles of dried root and herb tied with thin strips of leather, things she didn't recognize by sight. The smell that rose from them was faint, sweet with something slightly bitter running underneath. Calming somehow, like breathing slower. She looked at them for a moment. Then she folded the cloth back up, put it away. When she turned, Jed was watching her. She met his gaze directly, offered no explanation. He looked away first. They climbed back onto the wagon and continued up the mountain. And in Jed Cain's mind, something brief and unwanted surfaced, the image of a young man in a gray cornfield in Virginia, 18 years gone, a rifle still warm in his hands. He pushed it back down before it could take shape. He had learned to do that. He was very good at it by now. The trail kept climbing. The sky above the peaks deepened to a blue that had no equivalent anywhere below the tree line, a blue that went back forever. Daphne Rixley looked at that sky and said nothing. But she was smiling. The cabin appeared when the light had gone long and golden late afternoon, painting everything in amber and shadow. It was not what she had expected. She had been building a picture in her mind during those hours on the wagon, something rough and minimal, 4 walls and a roof thrown up by a man who thought shelter, and nothing more. What she found instead was a structure that had been built with a kind of stubborn, deliberate care. Solid log walls with the chinking set neat between the timbers. A porch broad enough to work on with a good overhang above it. Shutters on the windows, real shutters, the kind you hang when you care about what's inside. And around the far corner, just barely visible, the overgrown green of a kitchen garden that had been started by someone who had at some point intended to tend it. Someone had wanted this place to be something. She kept that observation off her face. But she filed it away in the same place. She filed the checked rungs on the ladder, the folded cloth, and the way his jaw had moved when he saw Bessa Ironwood press that bundle into her hand. Jed pulled the wagon up close and climbed down. He began unloading without any ceremony. Daphne stepped down and turned to face the mountain rising behind the cabin. It was enormous up here, closer than it had looked from town, more present, more alive somehow, as if the mountain were aware of her in a way she hadn't quite anticipated. The sky above the peaks was that deep, endless blue she had noticed on the trail. She stood and looked at it for a moment. "It's beautiful," she said, not to Jed, more to the mountain itself. He carried her trunk toward the cabin door and didn't respond. Inside the main room was large and single kitchen and living space together, a heavy wooden table, a stone fireplace with a good broad hearth. Shelves along one wall loaded with supplies and tools, and she noted with surprise 3 actual books, not almanacs or catalogs. Books. And against the far wall a wooden ladder rising to a low loft under the roof. Jed set her trunk at the foot of the ladder. He looked up at the loft, then at her. "Up there," he said. She looked at the ladder, put her hand on the lowest rung and tested it. Solid. Every rung solid, clean of dust where hands would grip. Someone had checked them recently. She climbed up. The loft was small, a narrow mattress, a low ceiling that a tall person would have to crouch under, a window at the east end. Through that window she could see the line of pines, and above them the last light retreating from the mountain peaks. She would wake up to that every morning. "Meals at 6 and 6. Jed's voice came from below, flat and matter-of-fact. "Don't expect any fussing." His boots crossed the floor. The door opened. The door closed. She was alone. She sat on the edge of the mattress, put her hands on her knees, looked at the window. Outside, the mountain was moving from gold to deep purple in the failing light, unhurried and enormous, and entirely indifferent to her. She gave herself exactly 4 minutes of doubt, 4 minutes of honest reckoning, whether she had made a terrible mistake, whether a man that cold was worth the effort, whether that view through the window was worth what she was going to have to fight for every single day. At the end of 4 minutes, she reached into her coat, took out the cloth bundle, held it in both hands, breathed in the faint, bittersweet smell. Then she put it carefully under the mattress for safekeeping, reached into her traveling bag for the small notebook she'd carried all the way from Philadelphia. A pen, an inkwell wrapped in cloth. She began to write. Whatever she wrote that evening, I couldn't tell you. That notebook was locked by morning and never opened in front of anyone. But when she put it away, she was smiling. The first week passed, the way mountain water moves quietly, wearing at the edges of things, without anyone quite noticing the change. The routine established itself quickly. Jed was up before first light. Coffee was made and waiting by the time gray showed in the eastern sky, coffee so dark and strong it could have stood a spoon upright in it without complaint. He drank 2 cups at the kitchen window watching the mountain. Then he was gone. He didn't say where he was going, didn't say when he'd be back. He left the way a man leaves when he has spent so many years entirely alone that the idea of informing anyone of his movements has simply ceased to occur to him. The first morning Daphne came down from the loft to find the coffee made and the man gone. She poured herself a cup, stood at the same window, looked at the same mountain. Then she went to work. She found the pantry, found the flour, the salt, the dried beans, the side of bacon wrapped in waxed cloth, found a small collection of herbs hanging to dry from the rafters, someone's attempt at a kitchen garden picked and stored, though the picking had been a while ago. She cooked breakfast enough for 2 people and left half of it covered on the back of the stove. When Jed came in at noon, he looked at the covered plate, said nothing, ate it. She was in the kitchen garden by then, pulling weeds. Second day, third day. The pattern held without either of them acknowledging it as a pattern. On the 4th morning, she woke to find a fresh split of firewood stacked neatly on the small porch outside the lower door, the door near the foot of the loft ladder, the one she used to go in and out without crossing the main room, stacked there specifically, for her use. She didn't mention it. Neither did he. That afternoon she found the axe leaning against the back wall of the cabin and decided she would split some of the longer rounds herself. She swung it well enough for a first attempt, making up in stubbornness what she lacked in technique. On her 5th swing, the blade sank into a greenwood round and stuck fast. She pulled. The round tilted sideways and refused. She pulled harder, planting her feet and leaning back with everything she had. The axe came free all at once, the round flew sideways, and Daphne Rixley sat down hard in the snow with her feet in the air and the axe handle across her lap. She lay there for a moment, looked straight up at the sky between the pines. It was the most extraordinary shade of blue she had ever seen in her life. She began to laugh, not a polite laugh, not a careful laugh, but a full and genuine and delighted laugh, loud in the mountain stillness, startling a pair of jays off a nearby branch. She laughed until her ribs ached. From behind the kitchen window, Jedodiah Cain stood with his coffee cup halfway to his mouth. He watched her lying in the snow, laughing at the sky. He watched a moment longer than he should have. Then he turned away. But the corner of his mouth had moved. Just the corner. Just once. He set down his coffee cup, poured himself a second cup, and he stood at that window a little longer than usual before he finally turned away for good. On the 6th day, Clovis Redden came up the mountain. He arrived on a steady gray mule moving through the morning pines with the unhurried confidence of a man who had made this climb more times than he could count. White beard, patient eyes, a battered hat that looked as if it had survived everything Montana had ever thrown at a person. He was 67 years old and built like he fully intended to reach 90. Jed met him at the gate. They shook hands, not with warmth and not with coldness either, but with the simple directness of 2 men who know each other completely and have no use for performance. Heard she arrived, Clovis said. She did. And she's here. Clovis waited. Apparently that was all Jed was offering. The old man's eyes moved past Jed toward the cabin. Through the kitchen window just visible from the gate, Daphne was at the stove. Clovis watched her for a moment. Then he looked back at Jed. She looked stronger than the letter suggested. The letter said she was sturdy and in good health. And is she? A pause. She hasn't complained. Clovis nodded slowly. That is not an answer. It's the one I've got. They walked up to the cabin. Daphne met them at the door, wiping her hands on her apron. Clovis removed his hat immediately and held it against his chest. Ma'am. Clovis reddened, genuinely pleased to make your acquaintance. Something eased in her posture. Real warmth offered plainly. It was different from the way Crow's Bend had looked at her. That town had looked at her like a curiosity. Clovis looked at her like a person. Daphne Rixley, she said. Then a small pause. Cain, I suppose. You suppose right, he smiled. That coffee I can smell from the gate. Is there any despair for an old man who rode all this way on a disagreeable mule? There's always coffee, she said, and stepped aside to let them in. They sat at the long table, Jed and Clovis on one side, Daphne at the far end, close enough to be present, but not crowding. She had learned in the first week that the geography of the cabin mattered to Jed. He needed space the way some people need air. Clovis didn't spend long on pleasantries. He set down his cup and looked at Jed steadily. Word from town. A man came through from Denver 3 days ago. Name of Collier. Wade Collier. He paused. He was asking questions about the land up here. The temperature in the room dropped by about 10 degrees. Jed set his cup down. Carefully. Asking what exactly? Who was living up here? How long? Whether there had been any recent survey work in the area. Clovis held his gaze. He had papers in his coat, Jed. I saw the edge of them when he turned. Silence. I'm not selling, Jed said. I didn't say sell. I said he has papers. The kind of silence followed that meant something was being processed that neither man was prepared to speak aloud. Not yet. Not in present company. Daphne looked from one face to the other, said nothing, stored everything. Clovis finished his coffee and eventually found a moment to speak with Daphne alone when Jed went out to check on the horse, or at least that was how it appeared. She suspected they had arranged it without words. The old man settled his large weathered hands around his cup and looked at her directly. How is he treating you? Politely, she said. Distantly. About what I expected. He nodded slowly. He's not a bad man, Miss Daphne. I want you to know that before you make up your mind about anything. I haven't made up my mind. I just arrived. Some people decide things fast up here. The mountain does that to a person. Clarifies things. He looked out the window at the peaks. Jed Cain has been alone a long time. He's forgotten certain things. What kind of things? Clovis turned back to her. His old eyes were kind and careful at once. How to let somebody matter to him. He reached for his hat. Give it time. If it's there, it'll show. And if it isn't? The old man put his hat on. Then at least you'll have had the mountain. He climbed back down on his gray mule and disappeared into the pines. Daphne stood on the porch and watched him go until the trees swallowed him whole. Behind her, Jed appeared in the doorway. He talked to you. His voice was even neither warm nor cold. A little. What did he say? She turned around and looked at him standing in his own doorway in the afternoon light. He said, "You're not a bad man." Jed said nothing. I told him I hadn't decided anything yet. She held his gaze. He seemed to find that satisfactory. She went back inside. After a moment, so did he. The second week taught Daphne things no one could have warned her about in advance. It taught her the specific quality of silence that existed at this altitude. Not the silence of an empty city street late at night. That kind of silence still carries a low hum underneath it, the sound of civilization idling. this was different. This was the silence of something enormously alive that simply did not need to make noise to prove it. It took her 4 days to stop resisting it, and 2 more days to begin hearing what was actually inside it. The creek, a quarter-mile east, ran over a certain arrangement of stones that produced something close to music, not a melody exactly, but a rhythm, reliable and clear. The pines in wind sounded nothing like the oaks she had grown up with. There was a bird she didn't yet know by name she would eventually ask Jed that called 3 times every morning just before light, and 3 times every evening just before dark. Regular as a clock, more reliable than most things she had known. She started listening for it before she opened her eyes each morning. She also learned to read Jed's silences. He had several distinct varieties. The closed silence the wall he had used in the first days built of indifference. The careful silence, the newer kind, the one he used when something she said had caught him off guard, and he needed time to process it without letting on that it had. And then there was a third kind, which she only began to detect at the end of the 2nd week. The watching silence, when she was in the garden, when she was at the stove, when she sat in the evenings at the loft window reading. There would be a stillness at the edge of her awareness, a presence not crowding or threatening just there. She would turn and find nothing. But she had the constant sense that she had turned half a second too late. She didn't mention it. She filed it away and let it sit. On the 3rd day of the 2nd week, she came in from hanging laundry to find a rocking chair beside the east window. It had not been there that morning. She stood and looked at it for a moment without moving. Smooth, dark wood. Good joinery, the kind that comes from patience and a proper understanding of how wood wants to move. An old cushion that had been recently opened along one seam and restuffed. She could see where the thread had been replaced, neat and tight. She sat in it. It rocked perfectly, balanced as if made for exactly this floor, this window, this particular angle of morning light. Jed was at the table with his back to her, working at a piece of tack leather, his hands moving in slow, deliberate strokes. "Where did this come from?" she asked. "Storage." He didn't look up. "It's good work." "It's old." She looked at the new thread on the cushion seam, the clean frame, the smooth, balanced rock of it. "It didn't look like this when it came out of storage." He said nothing. She rocked slowly, looking out at the mountain. The aspens on the near slope had begun to turn gold, coming in at the edges of the leaves, slow and inevitable the way good things often arrive. "Thank you," she said. He grunted once, kept working. She smiled at the window and did not mention it again. The wolf came on the 8th night. She heard it first just after midnight, a long call that rose from somewhere on the eastern slope and hung in the cold air long after the sound itself had faded. She lay still in the loft and listened. It called again, closer, a 3rd time, much closer. Boots on the floor below. She heard Jed rise without hurry, heard the deliberate, unhesitating sound of him checking his rifle. She climbed down the ladder. He was by the door coat on rifle in his right hand. He looked at her without surprise. Apparently the sound of her on the ladder had not been unexpected. "Wolf," he said. "I heard." "Stay inside." He moved toward the door. "You're going out alone." "I always go out alone." She looked at him, at the door, at him again. "How long will you be?" This seemed to catch him, the simple fact of someone wanting to know. He considered it a moment. "Not long." He pulled the door open. Cold air came in sharp and clean as a blade. "Keep the fire." He was gone. She fed the fire, settled into the rocking chair and listened to the mountain. It was completely quiet out there now, a different kind of quiet from the living silence of the days. This was the silence of held breath, everything in the dark out there waiting. She realized she was holding her own breath. 15 minutes passed. 20. She watched the fire and counted the logs and did not look at the clock on the shelf. Then one shot, distant enough to come as a clean, separate sound, final and definite. Then silence again, then boots on the porch steps. He came in and set the rifle by the door. His coat had blood on the upper sleeve. She assessed the angle immediately, as she had learned to assess things quietly. Not a wound. The angle was wrong. He had been close to the animal when it fell. He moved to the wash bowl, began to clean his hands. Daphne stood up from the rocking chair. She took the cloth that hung on the hook beside the wash bowl, held it out to him. He turned, looked at the cloth, looked at her, took it. He cleaned his hands, set the cloth on the table beside the wash bowl, poured himself a cup of whatever remained in the coffee pot, lukewarm by now, strong enough to strip paint from good wood. He sat down, did not speak. She sat back down in the rocking chair. Neither of them spoke. The fire settled and popped. Outside, the mountain breathed slowly in the dark. Finally she said, quiet as the room itself, "What do you do when there are two of them?" He looked up from his cup. "Two wolves," she said. "What do you do then?" He looked at her for a moment. Something in his expression shifted, not softening exactly, more like the small, barely visible movement of clouds when the wind finally decides to change direction. "You plan better before you go out," he said. She nodded. "Good to know." She got up, climbed the ladder, said good night. He sat alone below with his cooling coffee and the dying fire and the dark mountain pressing in quiet against the cabin walls. The next morning the cloth she had handed him was folded neatly on the table beside the wash bowl, not tossed aside, not left in a heap, folded. "Now here is what I need you to hold on to right here before we go any further with this story." That was the first time Jedodiah Cain accepted something from another person without asking why. He hadn't asked why she'd stayed up waiting. He hadn't asked why she'd offered the cloth. He had simply taken it, without calculating the debt, without assigning a motive, without turning it into something that needed to be managed or returned or refused. For a man who had spent 5 years turning away everything offered to him, every kindness, every attempt at connection, every small human gesture that folded cloth on that table in the morning light, was something closer to a revolution than most people ever get to witness. She didn't fully understand that yet, but she would. The third week arrived the way most important things arrive, quietly, without announcement, wearing the face of an ordinary morning. Daphne had established a rhythm by then, up before Jed when she could manage it. Coffee made and waiting. Breakfast started before he came through the door from whatever he did in the first gray hour before light. She had noticed that this mattered to him, not that she cooked, but that the cabin was already alive when he returned to it, as if the presence of warmth and smell and sound confirmed something he was not entirely sure of on those cold morning walks. She never said this out loud. She simply kept doing it. On that particular morning she was cleaning, not the quick surface cleaning of a woman going through motions, but the thorough kind, moving things, getting behind them, learning the bones of the place she now lived in. She had already found where Jed stored his extra ammunition, his spare trapping wire, his small, leather-bound ledger of expenses and trade records. She touched none of it. She was simply building a map. It was behind the bookshelf on the east wall that she found the box. She wasn't looking for it. She was pushing the shelf slightly to sweep behind it, and the motion knocked something from the narrow gap between the shelf and the wall. It hit the floor with a sound too soft for wood alone. She picked it up, a box the size of a thick book. Pale wood, sanded smooth and finished carefully. Someone had put real time into this. A small brass lock tarnished dark. She lifted the box gently and shook it the smallest amount. Something shifted inside. Light, soft, like folded cloth. She set it on the table, stood looking at it for a moment. Then she went back to sweeping. She was at the stove when Jed came in. He saw the box on the table before he saw anything else. She could tell by the way his entire body stopped in the doorway, not a flinch, nothing dramatic, just a complete and total stillness that lasted exactly long enough to tell her everything. She turned from the stove. "It fell when I moved the shelf. I didn't open it." He looked at the box, then at her. His face had gone to stone. She held his gaze and said nothing more. She had learned that with this man less was nearly always right. He crossed the room, lifted the box from the table, stood holding it for a moment with his back to her. Then he walked to the door, opened it, and stepped outside. She moved to the window, watched him cross the yard through the light snow. He went to the large ponderosa pine at the far edge of the clearing, the biggest tree, the oldest one, the one that had been there long before any cabin. He stood beside it and set the box down in the snow at its base. Then he stood there. He stood beside that tree in the cold for a long time, not doing anything, not moving, just standing the way a man stands when he has run out of places to put something and hasn't yet figured out what to do next. Daphne watched from the window. She did not go out. She understood in a way she could not have explained that going out there would have been the wrong thing. Some moments belong entirely to the person living them. The most respectful thing you can do is let them have it. She went back to the stove. Jed came inside 20 minutes later. He did not have the box with him. He sat down at the table, poured himself coffee that had gone nearly cold, and held the cup without drinking from it. Daphne set a fresh, hot cup in front of him and took the cold one away without a word. He looked at the new cup, then at her. She had already turned back to the stove. Late that night, long after she had climbed to the loft and the cabin had gone quiet, she heard the door open. Slow footsteps across the yard, the creak of snow underfoot. A pause, then footsteps returning. The door opening again, closing. In the morning the box was back behind the bookshelf. Someone had wrapped it in a length of clean cloth, new cloth, not the old kind, as if whatever was inside needed to be kept a little warmer than it had been before. Narrator: I'll tell you what was in that box, but not yet. Some things have to be earned, and Jedodiah Cain had not yet found a way to say the words out loud. He would, but that night was not the night. The old man came up the mountain again at the start of the 4th week. This time his face was different, still patient, still careful, but with something underneath a weight that hadn't been there on his first visit. Jed saw it the moment Clovis came through the gate and met him halfway across the yard. "More news from Collier," Jed said. "Some." Clovis pulled his hat brim down against the wind. He went and talked to Judge Albright, showed him the land papers. The judge took a look and didn't say no. Jed said nothing for a moment. Didn't say yes either. Not yet. Clovis looked at him straight. He's going back to Denver for more documentation. He'll be back before winter. This is moving now, Jed. It's not just talk anymore. They stood in the yard with the wind coming through the pines and the mountain leaning over them, and both of them knowing what the other was thinking without having to say it. "I know about the papers," Jed said finally. "I've known since before she came." Clovis looked at him for a long moment. "I figured you did." He paused. "Does she know?" "No. You going to tell her?" Jed looked toward the cabin. Through the kitchen window Daphne was visible at the table, writing in a small book. "When there's something solid to tell." "When there's something solid," Clovis repeated quietly. It wasn't agreement, but it wasn't argument either. The old man let it sit. They went inside. Clovis had a particular gift for finding himself alone with Daphne at the right moments. She suspected Jed allowed it, maybe even arranged it in the wordless way he arranged most things. This time the old man found her at the kitchen window while Jed was outside splitting wood. Clovis poured himself coffee and settled at the table and looked at her with those patient brown eyes that had seen considerably more than they let on. "You're staying," he said. "Not a question." "I'm staying." He nodded slowly. "I wasn't certain first visit. Some people come up here and the mountain talks them out of it inside a week." "The mountain hasn't said anything discouraging so far." A small smile crossed the old face. "No, it wouldn't with you." He turned his cup in his hands. "What about him? He's still treating you like furniture." "Less so." She considered. "He made me a rocking chair." Clovis looked up sharply. "He made it, restored it, restuffed the cushion, checked every joint." She glanced at the chair by the window. Didn't mention it, just put it there. The old man was quiet for a moment. Something had shifted behind his eyes, recognition or something close to it. He looked at the rocking chair the way you look at evidence. "That's more than I expected," he said. "That's considerably more." "What does it mean?" Clovis looked back at her. "With Jed Cain, doing a thing matters more than saying a thing. Always has. Words he doesn't trust. But what his hands do—" He set down his cup. "What his hands do is true." She thought about the firewood stacked outside her door on the fourth morning, the rungs of the loft ladder cleaned and checked, the rocking chair rebuilt in silence and offered without ceremony. "Tell me about him," she said, "the part Clovis Redden actually knows." The old man was quiet for a while. Outside, the steady rhythm of Jed's splitting wood continued unhurried, precise. The sound of a man doing something so familiar, his mind was somewhere else entirely. "I've known Jed Cain for 12 years, Clovis said finally. "Known of him longer. We're not friends in the way most people mean the word. We're something harder to name." He paused. "He was a different man once. Before the war, maybe I didn't know him then. But after the war, when he came to this territory, he still had something in him. Some quality. Like a man who had seen bad things but hadn't made peace with them yet." Another pause. "Making peace with bad things is not always worse than not making peace." Daphne waited. "He had a wife," Clovis said. "Rebecca. She came out here with him years back. She tried. I believe she genuinely tried." He looked at the window. "But she was from good people back east, and this mountain is hard on people from good places back east. After what happened with the child, she couldn't stay." "What happened with the child?" Clovis shook his head gently. "That's his to tell, not mine." He looked at her directly. "But I'll say this, what happened cost him something I don't think he's ever gotten back. And I think he decided afterward that the cost was fair, that he deserved exactly what he got." "People who think they deserve bad things tend to arrange for more of them," Daphne said. Clovis looked at her for a long moment. "Yes," he said, "they do." He finished his coffee. He put on his hat. He looked at her one more time from the doorway. "Miss Daphne." His voice was careful. "Whatever's wrong with your health and something is—" "I'm not blind, don't let him find out from someone else. He doesn't handle surprises well, but he handles honesty better than most men I've known once he's had time to sit with it." She met his gaze and didn't deny anything. "I'll keep that in mind." He went down the mountain on his gray mule, and she stood on the porch until the pines took him. Then she went back inside to think about the right moment and how much time she actually had to find it. The moment announced itself on a Tuesday morning in October, the way the important moments often do, dressed as something ordinary, arriving without warning. Daphne was at the stove stirring a pot of cornmeal. Jed was behind her at the table with his ledger open, writing figures in his careful, angular hand. The morning was cold and bright, and the whole cabin smelled of wood smoke and coffee. She stopped stirring, not suddenly, not dramatically. She simply went still, her hand resting on the spoon, her eyes going to the window where the mountain caught the early light. She heard nothing. She saw nothing alarming. She was simply gone for a moment, present in her body but somewhere removed from the room, from the pot, from the morning. It lasted perhaps 10 seconds. "Miss Rixley?" Jed's voice came from behind her. Not loud, but carrying a particular quality she had not heard from him before. She came back, blinked once. "Yes." "You went somewhere." "I'm fine." He said nothing, but she felt his attention change, not the casual background awareness he maintained, but something sharper directed. He was watching her now the way he watched the ridge line in the evening, checking for things that shouldn't be there. She finished breakfast, served it. They ate. Jed went out. But that afternoon, when she went to stand in the forest for a few minutes, something she had started doing on days when the cabin felt too small, she turned to find him 20 feet behind her. He hadn't followed her exactly. He was on his way somewhere else, or at least that was how it looked. But he was there. He looked at her. She looked at him. Neither spoke. He continued on his way. She stayed in the trees a little longer, looking at the light coming through the pines. Her hand was pressed flat against her sternum the way she sometimes held it without noticing, feeling the flutter underneath, the irregular beat that had been with her for so long now that she sometimes forgot it was not how hearts were supposed to work. She was running out of time to tell him. The only question was whether she was running out of courage first. He found her that evening. She was in the main room reading in the rocking chair by the east window. The mountain was going purple outside. The fire had settled low. Jed came in from outside, shrugged off his coat, and sat down at the table. He didn't pick up his ledger, didn't pour coffee. He just sat across the room from her, and after a moment she looked up from her book and found him watching her with those dark, level eyes. "You've never lied to me," he said, "but there's something you haven't told me." She set the book in her lap. "What makes you say that?" 12 years on this mountain. You learn to read when an animal is carrying something it's trying not to show." He paused. "You're carrying something." The fire settled in the grate. Outside the wind moved through the pines. She closed her book. "I'm going to die, Mr. Cain." The room was very quiet. "Not tomorrow," she said. Her voice was level. She had rehearsed this in the sense that she had lived with it long enough that the words no longer broke. "Not next month, but the doctor in Philadelphia said 1 to 2 years, maybe a little more with luck. My heart has been wrong since I was a girl. There's nothing that fixes it." Jed looked at her. He did not look away. "I didn't tell you before I came," she said, "because if I had, you would have put me back on the next stage. And I had already decided I wasn't going to die in Philadelphia waiting to die." She held his gaze. "I came here because I wanted to live. Whatever time there is, I intend to use it." In her mind briefly she was somewhere else. Philadelphia. A doctor's office. October of the previous year. The room smelled of linseed oil and camphor. The doctor was a small man with careful hands and the manner of someone accustomed to delivering news that couldn't be fixed. He read from his notes in a flat professional voice the way a man reads a ledger. 1 to 2 years. Manageable symptoms with medication. No cure available to current medicine. She had thanked him. Stood up. Walked into the hall. Her parents were waiting. They had looked at her face and understood immediately. And what she saw in her father's eyes in that first unguarded moment, it was not grief. It was not anger. It was something smaller and more honest than either of those things. It was the look of a man who had just learned that a complicated problem had a definite end date. She had understood then and there that she was going to leave. She was back in the cabin. The fire. The mountain outside. Jed Cain still watching her from across the room. He had not moved. He had not stood up. He had not looked away. He had not said anything about what she should have told him about what this meant about arrangements or practicalities or inconveniences. He was simply sitting across from her looking at her with an expression she could not fully read, not pity, not calculation. Something harder to name. The silence stretched. "I should have told you earlier," she said. "That's fair." "Yes." He said it without heat, just acknowledgement. "You should have." "Would it have changed things?" He looked at the table for a moment, then back at her. "I would have sent you back." "I know." "And you knew that?" "Yes." Another silence. Then something unexpected. He stood up, walked to the stove. He poured 2 cups of coffee with his back to her, not rushed, not violent, just moving the way he always moved. He brought both cups to the table, set one in front of her chair, sat back down. He picked up his ledger, opened it, began to write figures. She sat for a moment looking at the cup of coffee he had set out for her. Then she got up from the rocking chair, walked to the table, and sat down. She picked up the coffee, drank. He wrote in his ledger. She read her book. The fire burned low, and neither of them fed it, and neither of them mentioned it, and the cabin grew slightly colder, and neither of them moved to do anything about that either. He stayed in the room. That was the thing. He stayed. Narrator. In all the words I have ever spent on Jedodiah Cain, this is still the one that matters most. He stayed in the room. After everything she had told him, after every reason he had to stand up and walk out and put the wall back in place, he picked up his ledger and he stayed. A man who had spent 5 years walking away from anything that could hurt him. And he stayed. The first real blizzard of the season came 3 days after that conversation. Clovis had warned of it on his last visit, a cold front moving in from the northwest, the kind that comes fast and stays long. Jed had spent those 3 days preparing with a thoroughness that Daphne now recognized as his particular form of care. He checked the roof. He brought in extra firewood and stacked it in a dry corner of the main room. He checked the storm shutters on every window. He filled every available container with clean water. He did all of it without comment, without asking whether she was worried, without explaining what he was preparing for. He simply prepared the way a man prepares when he knows exactly what is coming and has made his peace with it. The storm hit on the 3rd night. By morning the snow was falling so thick and fast that the pines 20 feet from the cabin were gone, not invisible exactly, but reduced to dark shapes behind a wall of white. The wind was something you felt in the walls and the floor, in the low, steady moan of it along the eaves. The trail down to Crow's Bend had ceased to exist. They were not going anywhere. She understood this before she climbed down the loft ladder. She had known it was coming, had heard the wind shift in the night. She dressed carefully, came downstairs, and found Jed already at the stove, coffee made, the fire running high. "How long?" she asked. "Day. Maybe 2. He poured her coffee without being asked. "We're fine on supplies." "I know." She went to the window and looked out at the white. "I'm not worried about supplies." He looked at her. "What are you worried about?" She turned from the window. "Nothing. I just like to know what I'm dealing with." The storm settled in around them like a second cabin built over the first one, pressing in from every side, making the space inside feel both smaller and somehow more significant, more deliberate, as if everything unnecessary had been stripped away by the weather, leaving only what was actually here. Them. The fire. The mountain. The day passed in a strange, suspended quiet. She baked bread. He worked on a length of harness that needed replacing. They ate lunch without much conversation. In the afternoon he read. She mended a shirt. It was evening before the real silence arrived. The fire had burned low again. Jed had fed it once, but the storm was pulling the heat out of the cabin faster than usual, and the room had a chill to it that made the space between them smaller. She had moved from the rocking chair to the bench nearer the hearth. He was in his chair, the book closed on his knee, watching the fire. "What are you most afraid of?" she asked. He looked at her. "Genuinely asking," she said. "Not to pry, we've been in the same 4 walls for 2 days now, and I don't know the answer to that question. I don't know almost anything about you, really." "You know enough. I know what your hands tell me. That's different from knowing you." He was quiet for a long time. The wind pressed against the shutters with a low, persistent sound. The fire snapped. "Nothing," he said finally. "That's not an answer. Nothing left to be afraid of. When you've lost the things that mattered, fear becomes smaller, less useful." She looked at him steadily. The things that mattered, what were they? He was quiet again. This quiet was different from the others, heavier. She had the sense of watching a man stand at the edge of something and decide whether to step back or keep going. "I had a wife," he said. "Rebecca. She left in 1879. Clovis mentioned. The part he'd know. He looked at the fire. There was a child. It wasn't born alive." He stopped. "After that she went. I didn't stop her. Didn't have the right to stop her." The cabin was very still. "I'm sorry," Daphne said. She meant it in the plain, undecorated way, not as a formality, not as a performance, just as the truth. He nodded once, the nod of a man acknowledging receipt of something he doesn't quite know what to do with. "That's why you're up here," she said. "Not because you like the solitude." "I like the solitude now." "That's not the same thing." His jaw moved. He looked at the fire. "No," he said. It's not. She was quiet for a moment. You decided you deserved it. The solitude, the mountain, all of it. His head came up. He looked at her. I'm not judging it, she said. I understand the arithmetic. Something terrible happens, and you go looking for the equation that makes sense of it. And the easiest equation is always the one where it's your fault. She paused. It's neater that way. What would you know about that? I spent 14 years being the equation my family was trying to balance. She held his gaze. When the doctor told me I had a year or two, the first thing my father thought was, this is where it ends. I saw it in his face before he could cover it. He was relieved. Her voice stayed even. And I understood it, actually. I had been a complicated problem for a long time. It's exhausting to love a problem. She looked at the fire. So I left. I thought if I am going to be a problem, I would rather be my own problem than someone else's. The storm moved over the cabin in long, slow waves of sound, wind and snow and the deep cold of the mountain pressing in. Jed watched her. Not the way he had watched her in those first days, that distant appraising look. Something different now. Something that had no name he would have been comfortable applying to it. You came all this way, he said. I came all this way. Knowing what the doctor said. Especially knowing. She looked at him. I'm not afraid of dying, Mr. Cain. I told you that before. But I was afraid of never having been truly here. Of spending whatever time I had left in the corner of someone else's life, being managed, being careful, being small. She paused. Up here, I'm not small. He said nothing for a long time. Then he stood up. She watched him cross the room. Not toward the door, she noticed that immediately. He went to the far side of the cabin, to a low door she had assumed was a storage closet. He opened it. Inside was a space she had not explored deeper than it looked from outside, and it was stacked floor to ceiling with split firewood, seasoned, dry, neatly racked. Not a cord, not two cords, enough to burn hot through the longest, worst winter that mountain had ever produced. She stood up from the bench, walked over, looked at the firewood. She looked at him. He had known the blizzard was coming, Clovis had told him 3 days ago. 3 days would have been enough to stack this much wood if you worked hard. But this wood was not 3 days old. The color of the cut faces, the depth of the seasoning, this had been cut and stacked weeks before the storm, maybe longer. He had prepared for this, not just for the storm, for being here with someone, for the long cold nights and the closed trails and the days when the mountain made its own decisions about who went where. He had prepared for 2 people before he had admitted to himself that he wanted there to be 2 people. She looked at the firewood for a moment longer. Then she looked at him standing beside her in the low doorway. You knew, she said, quietly. He didn't answer. He reached into the stack and pulled out a piece of seasoned wood, carried it to the hearth, set it on the fire. The flames took it immediately strong and bright and clean, pushing the chill back, filling the room with warmth that reached the corners. He sat back down in his chair. She sat back down on the bench near the fire. The storm howled outside, and neither of them flinched at it. The light was amber and steady. The warmth spread through the room, and neither of them said anything more for a long while. Narrator. That firewood was not a declaration. Jedodiah Cain was not a man who made declarations. It was something quieter and more difficult than that. It was a man who had spent 5 years building walls, looking at a stack of wood, and understanding maybe for the first time in a long time that he had been building toward something, not just away from it. He had not admitted that to himself when he cut the wood. He was admitting it now in the amber light, with the storm pressing against the shutters and the woman across from him who had traveled 2,000 miles to not be small. She was not small. He was beginning to understand that no wall he had ever built was going to change that fact. November arrived without ceremony, the way November always does in Montana. One morning you wake up and the world has simply decided to be colder, and that's the end of the discussion. The days had shortened to a narrow wedge of light between 2 long walls of dark. Jed was up and out before the sun cleared the ridge. He was back before it dropped behind the peaks to the west. The in-between hours he spent on the mountain doing things she still could not fully account for: checking trap lines, reading sign, maintaining the particular relationship with the land that kept him fed and kept the cabin in fuel and kept the wolves at a respectful distance. She had learned to read his returns. The angle of his shoulders when he came through the door told her whether the morning had gone well or badly. The way he set down the rifle carefully or with a small extra weight told her whether he was carrying something worth talking about. He almost never talked about it. But she knew, and knowing without being told had become its own kind of conversation between them. The days had a quiet warmth to them now that the first weeks had entirely lacked. Not warmth he announced or explained. Warmth that accumulated in small actions the way snow accumulates each flake invisible on its own, and then one morning you look up and everything has changed. He had started leaving the coffee pot within her reach before he went out. A small thing. She noticed it the second time he did it and said nothing. The third time she understood it was permanent. He had started returning for lunch instead of staying on the mountain through the middle of the day. He gave no explanation for this change. She gave no indication that she had noticed. But she always had food ready when he came through the door, and he always ate it, and neither of them pretended it was anything other than what it was. She had learned the names of the birds. He had taught her in his way, not sitting down and explaining but naming things as they appeared. A flash of black and white in the pines. Clark's nutcracker, a small brown shape at the feeder she had built from scrap wood and hung outside the kitchen window. Mountain chickadee. He never repeated a name. She never forgot one. These were the days before the floor gave up its secret. It happened on a Wednesday, in the third week of November. She was alone. Jed had gone further up the mountain than usual that morning to check traps in the high country before the next snow made the trail impassable for the better part of a week. He had told her this, a thing he would not have done a month ago. Simply told her standing at the door with his coat on, not looking at her directly, the words offered plain and unadorned. High country today, back before dark, then gone. She had spent the morning making an inventory of the pantry and was now scrubbing the kitchen floor, working her way toward the far wall where the supply shelves stood on their wide, solid legs. She pushed the second shelf to clean behind it, felt resistance at the base, pushed harder. A section of floorboard shifted, not a loose board, a fitted one. A short section of 3 boards cut to a specific length set into the floor without nails. She had swept over this spot a dozen times and never noticed. She would not have noticed now except that the edge of the shelf foot had been sitting on the corner of the center board, holding it down, and moving the shelf had freed it. She knelt, pressed the board down on one end, the other end lifted. Below was a shallow space, perhaps 8 inches deep, running the width of all 3 boards. Cool and dry and dark. Inside were 2 things. The first was a military coat. Dark wool folded with precision, the kind of precision that comes from years of practice. She lifted it out and unfolded enough to see the front. Union Army. Officer's rank on the shoulder, though the insignia had been removed carefully, the threads cut clean and close. Someone had taken those insignia off slowly, deliberately, the way you take something off when you're not sure whether you're putting it down or putting it away for good. The second thing was a leather portfolio thick with papers. She opened it. Survey maps. Detailed, precise, professionally executed. Montana Territory. Wyoming Territory. Townships and ranges marked in careful ink. Boundary lines drawn with a surveyor's exactitude. At the bottom corner of each page in small clear lettering, U.S. General Land Office. And beside that, on every single page without exception, a signature. J. Cain, Survey Agent. She sat back on her heels and held the portfolio in both hands and looked at it for a long time. Then she got up. She put the portfolio on the table. She folded the coat and placed it beside the portfolio. She replaced the floorboards carefully, moved the shelf back, and finished scrubbing the floor. She put a fresh pot of coffee on the stove. Then she sat down and waited. He came through the door just before the light gave out the way he always did. He pulled off his coat, turned from the door. He saw the portfolio on the table. He saw the folded coat. He stopped. Not the whole-body freeze of a man caught doing something wrong. More the stillness of a man who has been walking toward a particular moment for a long time and has just arrived at it. Daphne was at the table, both hands around her coffee cup, watching him without urgency. "The shelf moved it," she said. "I didn't go looking." "I know." His voice was even. He was looking at the portfolio. "You were a government surveyor." "Yes." "Not a trapper?" "Not always." "No." He crossed the room. He stood at the table but did not sit. He looked at the portfolio the way a man looks at an old wound he has decided to stop pretending doesn't exist. From 75 to 78, after the Army. She waited. "We mapped and measured and filed papers," he said. 12 men. We covered the Western Territories, most of Montana and Wyoming. The land got divided into parcels. The parcels got sold. People who had been living on that land, farming it, ranching it, some of their families for 2 generations, they got notices, move or face removal. The fire was the only sound in the room for a moment. "How many parcels?" she asked. "My name is on 17 survey reports." He pulled out the chair and sat down. Not because he wanted to sit, because what he was saying required it. 17 times I signed a document that moved a family off their land. 17 times I told myself it was legal, it was orderly, it was progress, it was what had to happen. He looked at his hands on the table. Clovis Redden was one of them. The room was very quiet. "He knows," she said. "He's always known. And he still comes up this mountain." Jed was quiet for a moment. "That is something I have never fully understood about that man." She looked at him across the table. "Why did you stop the surveying?" He was quiet for a long time. When he spoke, he chose the words the way a man chooses steps across uncertain ground, carefully, one at a time. "There was a man named Harlan Buse." He said the name the way you say the name of something you have lived alongside long enough that it has lost its power to surprise you, but not its power to sit heavy. He was not a government man. He was a private operator. He bought land, and he resold it, and he was not particular about how he moved the people who were already on it. A pause. "He used us. He got ahead of our survey work and bought options on parcels before we finalized the boundaries. By the time we filed, the land was already his on paper. It was legal. I told myself it was legal. But in the winter of 78, I went back to a parcel we had surveyed in the spring. I had questions about the boundary on one section, and I found what was left." He stopped. A family had been on that land. Bus had told them to go. They had not gone fast enough. Their house had been burned. The fire crackled. They got out. Barely. His jaw worked. A woman and 3 children. The husband had gone for supplies. He came back to Ash. She said nothing. Let him continue at his own pace. "I filed a complaint. My supervisor told me it was a private matter between landowner and previous occupant. I filed another complaint. I was told that the survey work was done correctly and that what individuals did with their legally acquired land was outside our jurisdiction." He looked at the table. "I signed my resignation the next morning." And Buse. He kept buying, kept moving people. He had a method: first the letter, then the men, then the fire. By 79 he had run 6 families out of their homes, and nobody in the territory had done a single thing about it. Something changed in his voice. Not anger. Something colder and more settled than anger. He was working on a 7th. He looked up at her then. "I was there when he went to fire the 7th house," he said. "I had ridden out there for reasons I did not fully understand at the time. I told myself I wanted to talk to him, reason with him. But a man does not bring a rifle to a conversation." She held his gaze. "He had the torch lit when I arrived. The family was still inside, a husband and wife and 4 children. The youngest was 2 years old." He stopped. I called his name. He turned around. He looked at me. He made his decision. A pause. I made mine. The silence that followed had a particular weight. not the silence of judgment, the silence of two people sitting with the full, complicated truth of a thing. "You saved 4 children," she said. "I killed a man." "You saved 4 children." The town saw a body and a man standing over it with a rifle. His voice was flat. I did not offer an explanation. I did not see the point of explaining to people who had watched Buse operate for 2 years and done nothing. She looked at him for a long moment. "And so you came up here?" "And so I came up here." She reached across the table. Not to take his hand, she didn't do that. She placed her fingers on the survey portfolio and slid it back toward him. "Those maps aren't who you are anymore," she said. "They're what you did. That's different." He looked at the portfolio, then at her. "Is it?" he said. "Ask Clovis Redden," she said. "He'll give you a more informed answer than I can." She got up and went to the stove and brought back the coffee pot and refilled both cups. She sat back down. He picked up his cup. Neither of them said anything for a while. Outside, the first new snow of the night had begun to fall, soft and deliberate, covering the mountain in another layer of white. He did not put the portfolio back under the floor. He left it on the table. Clovis came up the mountain alone on a Thursday in late November, and his face told Jed everything before the old man had climbed down from his mule. It was not the face of a man bringing news. It was the face of a man who had been carrying something for a long time and had made the decision finally to set it down. Jed met him at the gate. They stood in the cold, their breath making short white clouds, and Jed waited. "I need to tell you something," Clovis said. "Something I should have told you a long time ago." "Then tell me." The old man looked at the cabin, looked back at Jed. "I'd rather say this out here." Daphne was inside. Jed had seen the shape of her through the window when he walked out. He understood. Some things require the cold and the open sky. Some things cannot be said in a warm room with someone listening from the next chair. They walked to the fence line where the pines started. The wind was low. The mountain leaned over them, pale and enormous in the gray November light. "Rebecca came back," Clovis said. The words dropped into the silence like a stone into still water. Jed looked at him. 1880, Clovis said. "About a year after she left. She came back to Crow's Bend. She didn't come to the mountain, she came to me first. She looked bad, thin. The man in Denver had left her. She said she had made a mistake. She said she wanted to know if it was possible to talk to you." Jed's face had gone to stone. Clovis held his gaze and kept going because stopping now would have been the worst possible thing. "I told her you had gone up the mountain and weren't receiving visitors." The old man's voice was steady and quiet, which was true as far as it went. "But I made it clear that coming up would not be welcome. I let her believe that you had made a decision about her." "And had I?" "I didn't know. I thought that if she went up that mountain you would take her back. And I thought that would be the end of you, that you would spend the rest of your life attached to something that had already broken you once." He paused. "I thought I was protecting you." Jed said nothing. The wind moved through the pines. "She went back to Denver," Clovis said. "I heard from her daughter, the girl from her first marriage. I heard that Rebecca passed in 1882, earlier that year, before you sent the letter east." The silence was very long. When Jed finally spoke, his voice was the same level low, containing everything. "The child," he said. "Did she give the child a name?" Clovis looked at him. "How did you know I'd know that?" "Because you know everything that happens in that town. You always have." The old man was quiet for a moment. "She told me the day she came back. I don't think she meant to. She'd been drinking some, and she was not in a good state. She said the name like it was something she had been carrying alone for a year and needed to say out loud." He paused. "Anna. She named her Anna." Jed closed his eyes, just for a second, just long enough. Then he opened them and looked at the mountain. "Anna," he said, quietly, testing the sound of it in the air, like a man saying a word in a language he was never taught, but has always somehow known. Clovis stood beside him and did not offer comfort. He understood that comfort was not what was needed. What was needed was exactly this. The cold, the mountain, the truth said plainly, no softening, no decoration. "Are you angry at me?" Clovis said finally. "I don't know yet." Jed looked at him. "Ask me again in a while." "How long a while?" "I don't know that either." Clovis nodded. He pulled his coat closer. He looked at the cabin. "She's good for you," he said. "Miss Daphne, better than you knew how to ask for." Jed said nothing. "I'm going to go in and have coffee," Clovis said. "You can come in when you're ready." He walked back up toward the cabin. Jed stood at the fence line with the pines at his back and the mountain above him and the name Anna moving through him the way cold moves through a house when a door has been opened, touching everything, settling into the corners, changing the temperature of every room. He stood there a long time. When he came inside, Daphne was at the stove. Clovis was at the table with his coffee. Neither of them looked at Jed when he entered, which was the right thing to do. He sat down. After a moment, Daphne brought a cup and set it in front of him and went back to the stove. He picked up the cup, held it, looked at the table. "Daphne." She turned. The child's name was Anna. She was still for a moment. Then she set down what she was holding and came to the table and sat across from him. She did not say she was sorry. She did not say anything at all for a full minute. Then she said, "That's a good name." He looked at her. "Anna Cain," she said. "It sounds like someone worth knowing." Something moved behind his eyes, passed through him, and was gone the way weather passes, leaving the air changed after it. Clovis drank his coffee and looked at the window and said nothing at all, and it was somehow exactly right. Before the old man left, he pulled Jed aside on the porch. "There's something else," Clovis said, "about the land." Jed waited. "Eleanor Voss came into town last week." He watched Jed's face. "She went to the judge's office, spent half an hour in there alone with him." Eleanor Voss, the widow of Harlan Buse. Jed had not spoken to that woman since the night her husband died. He had not expected to ever need to again. She say what she told him, "Not to me, but I heard from Tobin, who heard from the clerk, that she walked out of there looking like a woman who had put down something heavy." Clovis looked at him steadily. "I don't know what she said, but I know the judge has been quiet on the Collier matter since that meeting, which is different from how he was before." Jed said nothing. "Something is shifting," Clovis said. "I don't know which way yet, but something's shifting." He climbed down on his mule and went back into the pines. Jed stood on the porch and looked at the mountain and thought about Eleanor Voss in a judge's office, saying words he had never said himself for reasons he did not yet understand. He went inside. Daphne was in the rocking chair reading. "Clovis gone?" she asked without looking up. "Yes." She turned a page. He sat down at the table. He opened his ledger. He wrote nothing in it. After a while he closed it again and sat with his hands flat on the cover and looked at the fire. "Jed." He looked up. "Thank you," she said, "for telling me about Anna." He held her gaze for a moment. "You didn't ask?" "No." "Why didn't you ask? You've been curious since you found that box." She set her book down. "Because some things have to come when they're ready to come. You can't pull them out before then. You just have to be there when they arrive." She looked at him. "I was there." He looked at her for a long time. Then he picked up his ledger and opened it again, and this time he did write something in it, and she went back to her book, and the fire settled into its slow evening burn, and outside the mountain held them both without comment, in the way mountains do, massive and permanent and entirely without judgment. She told him on a morning in early December. Not the morning she knew. She had known for 3 weeks before she said anything, 3 weeks of observing him quietly and without pressure the way she observed everything. Watching how he moved through a day, how he handled things that surprised him, how he came back from the bad days, the quiet ones where something had gone wrong on the mountain, and he returned with it still sitting on his shoulders. She needed to know whether he was the kind of man who could hold something unexpected and not drop it. She decided after 3 weeks that he was. It was a plain morning. Gray sky, no wind, the kind of cold that settles in steadily rather than arriving in gusts. He was at the table with his knife and a piece of antler he was shaping into a handle. She was at the window with the mending basket, the light better there. She kept her eyes on the shirt in her hands. "You'll have a child by spring," she said. The knife stopped. She continued with the mending. Took 3 stitches. 4. His chair scraped. He stood up. She heard him set the knife down carefully on the table. Daphne. She looked up. He was standing, both hands flat on the table, looking at her with an expression she had not seen on him before. Not shock exactly, more like a man who has looked up from a very long walk and discovered he is somewhere entirely different from where he started and needs a moment to establish his bearings. "In the spring," she said again. "I believe late February or early March." He said nothing. The fire ticked. The gray light came through the window and lay across the floor between them. "I need you to hear 2 things," she said. "First, my health. I don't know what the pregnancy will do to it. It might be harder. It might in strange ways be easier. I don't know. I am telling you that honestly because I think you deserve the honesty." She set the mending in her lap. "Second, I need you not to look at me like I'm about to break, because I'm not made of the kind of material that breaks, and when people look at me that way, it makes me want to say something impolite." Something shifted in his face, just slightly. The corner of his mouth, the same place it had moved that first week when she had fallen in the snow and laughed at the sky. "What do you need?" he said. She had thought about how she would answer this question when it came. "I need you to keep looking at me the same way you've been looking at me," she said. "Like I'm a person who is here doing things present in the world. Not like I'm a problem that needs careful handling." She held his gaze. "Can you do that?" He looked at her for a long moment. "Yes," he said. One word. Flat and plain and absolute. The way he said everything that was true. She picked up the mending. He sat back down. He picked up the knife. The antler handle. His hands moved in their slow, deliberate way. After a while she heard what might have been a long, controlled breath exhaled quietly through his nose, the kind a man releases when he has been holding it without realizing. She kept her eyes on the shirt and said nothing about it. Collier came back on a Thursday in December. He came up the mountain this time instead of waiting in town. That was different. That told Jed things about the shift in Collier's timeline before the man opened his mouth. He rode up on a bay horse with the confidence of someone who had been thinking about this conversation for a while and had decided how it was going to go. Well dressed for the trail, which meant he had packed for the altitude, but not for the cold, which meant he had not been in Montana long enough to understand what the cold actually was. Jed met him outside. He did not invite him in. Collier smiled the way men smile when they want something from you and have decided friendliness is the most efficient route. "Mr. Cain, I appreciate you coming out. I know the timing isn't ideal. Say what you came to say." The smile adjusted itself to something a degree cooler. "The company is prepared to be reasonable about this. We're not interested in a legal fight that costs everyone time and money. We have a legitimate claim under the 78 transfer. What I'm authorized to offer you is—" "No." Collier stopped. "You haven't heard the number." "I don't need the number." "Mr. Cain." The professional patience came back into his voice. "I understand this place means something to you. I do. But you've been living on land you don't legally own for— I know what I've been living on." That stopped him. He looked at Jed with the slight recalibration of a man who has just discovered his opponent knows something he assumed they didn't. "Then you understand the position you're in." "I understand exactly the position I'm in. With a wife. And I hear—" He glanced toward the cabin. "In your current circumstances, it seems like the practical choice would be Mr. Collier." Jed's voice had not changed in volume or temperature through this entire conversation. It was the same voice he used to say Douglas fir and coffee's ready and stay inside. But something in it had closed the way a door closes when someone has made a final decision about who is and who is not coming through it. "You'll go back down the mountain now." Collier held his ground for a moment. He was not a coward, but there was something in Jed Cain's stillness that operated outside the normal rules of confrontation, something that said plainly and without drama that the man looking at him had already been to the far edge of whatever this conversation could produce and was not particularly concerned about it. Collier turned his horse. He was 20 feet down the trail when he looked back once. Jed was still standing in the same spot watching him go. Collier rode on. Jed stood in the yard until the sound of hooves was gone entirely. Then he stood a little longer. Daphne came to the door. She had been watching from the window. "He'll be back," she said. "Yes, with something worse than an offer." "Most likely." She looked at him. He was still watching the trail, though there was nothing to see now but pines and the distant pale shape of the lower mountain. "Is the land actually yours?" she asked. A pause. "No." She nodded slowly. "You knew this when you came up here." "I knew." "And you came anyway." "I came anyway." She stood in the doorway looking at him in the cold. The sky above the peaks was the winter gray that had no blue in it, flat and low and honest. "Then we'll figure out what comes next," she said. He turned and looked at her. "We." "Yes." She said it the same way he said the things he meant, plain, flat, absolute. "We." Clovis came up the following week with a letter from a lawyer in Helena. He read it at the table, Jed on one side and Daphne on the other, the old man's rough finger moving under the words with the slow care of someone who reads carefully because reading has always cost him something. The lawyer's opinion was measured and honest. There was a legal argument to be made on the basis of continuous habitation and improvements to the property. The precedent was not strong. It had been done before and had failed more often than not. There was one additional avenue: a child born on the property created a separate claim under a specific territorial statute, but that avenue was narrow and not guaranteed. The probability of prevailing, the letter said, was somewhere between 35 and 50%, depending on factors not yet known. Jed read the letter, set it down. 35 to 50, Clovis said. "Yes. You going to fight it?" Jed was quiet for a moment. He looked at the letter. He looked at Daphne across the table. She was looking back at him with that level, clear gaze she had, the one that did not ask anything of him, but did not let him disappear into himself either. "Yes," he said. Clovis nodded once. He folded the letter and set it beside the coffee pot. "There's one more thing," the old man said. He looked at Jed. "Eleanor Voss. I found out what she told the judge." The room was quiet. She told him about the night Harlan died, her version. He paused. The true version. She said she was at the window when Buse left the house that night with the torch. She saw him walking toward the McIntosh place. She heard you call his name. She heard the shot. He looked at the table. She said she has known since that night what you did and why you did it, and that she has spent 3 years telling herself it was none of her business. No one spoke. She said she changed her mind, Clovis said. She wouldn't say why, just that she changed her mind and thought the judge should have the full account. The fire burned in the grate. The mountain leaned against the cabin in its old, indifferent way. Jed looked at the table for a long time. Then he looked up, and the expression on his face was one that Daphne had never seen there before. Not relief exactly, and not gratitude either, but something that carried elements of both and went somewhere deeper than either. The look of a man who has been carrying a weight so long he has forgotten how heavy it is, and has just been told quietly that he does not have to carry it alone anymore. He said nothing. There was nothing adequate to say. Daphne reached across the table and placed her hand over his, briefly, firmly, not asking for anything, not offering anything except the plain fact of her presence. He turned his hand over and held hers, just for a moment. Then he released it and picked up his coffee and looked at the window and did not say anything at all. But the room had changed. The winter deepened through January and into February, and with it something else deepened too, something that had no name simple enough to use in polite conversation, but that Clovis, on his visits, saw clearly in the way a man who has watched both of them long enough to tell the difference. They had become not merely two people sharing a cabin and a set of practical arrangements. Something else. Something that had happened gradually and then all at once the way most true things happen. Jed had made her a second shelf above the east window for her books, which now numbered 6 acquired through Clovis and Tobin on their trips to town. He made it without announcement, came in one afternoon with the wood already cut and the brackets already fitted, and had it on the wall before she came down from the loft. She looked at it. She looked at him. She put the books on it and went back to what she was doing, and the look on her face in those few seconds was the kind of look that a man can live a long time on. She had learned to read his trap reports. He wrote them in his ledger in a shorthand she had decoded over the course of the fall, not because he explained it to her, but because she sat near enough to watch his pen move and ask the occasional question until the system became legible. She started keeping her own notes beside his. Observations on the weather, on the birds, on the small consistent patterns of life on the mountain that she had catalogued with the thoroughness of a woman who knows that paying attention to small things is never wasted. He read her notes. He never said so. But she could tell by the slight adjustments he made to his routes on the days after she had written something new. Tobin came up on a clear morning in mid-February with supplies and a letter from the Helena lawyer. He was 22 and unsubtle about his curiosity regarding the state of things at the cabin, his eyes moving between Jed and Daphne in a way that was not unkind, just young. He had a good heart and a loud face. He handed Jed the letter, helped unload the supplies, accepted coffee with the enthusiasm of a man who had ridden up a cold mountain on a cold horse. The letter from Helena had a number in it, not a probability this time, a date for an initial filing, a list of documents needed, a brief note at the bottom in the lawyer's careful hand. The statement from Mrs. Voss has altered the local political landscape in ways that may prove significant. Jed folded the letter. "Tell him we'll have the documents before the date." Tobin nodded. He was looking at Daphne with the expression he always got, the one that mixed admiration with a kind of awe, the way the young sometimes look at people who are doing something they have not yet found the courage to do themselves. "How are you feeling, Mrs. Cain?" "Like someone who intends to be here in May," she said. He grinned. "Yes, ma'am. That's what I'll tell folks." He finished his coffee and went back down the mountain on his horse, his voice carrying up faintly through the pines as he talked to the animal about the trail, because Tobin Larimore was the kind of person who talked to horses. That evening, Jed sat outside on the porch after supper. The air was cold, but still the particular stillness of a mountain night in late winter, when everything is settled and the only sound is the creek and the occasional comment of a pine bough adjusting its load of snow. He was reading a letter, a different letter, not the one from Helena. One that had come through Clovis 2 weeks ago that he had not mentioned to Daphne, that he had read in the barn where she would not see his face. It was from the lawyer again, but a different paragraph, the informal addendum that professional men sometimes add when they want to say something they cannot say in the official body of the letter. "The probability of a favorable ruling, in my honest estimate, is closer to 40% than 50. The territorial statutes are not sympathetic to adverse possession claims. I want you to have a clear picture before we proceed. 40%. He folded the letter, put it in his coat pocket, looked at the mountain. 40% of the land. 40% chance of keeping what had become in the course of 1 year and 1 woman and an extraordinary accumulation of small true things, the first home he had lived in since 1879. He heard the door behind him. Daphne came out with a blanket over her shoulders, moving carefully on the cold porch boards, and sat down beside him without asking for his permission or his opinion. She had entirely stopped asking for his permission or his opinion when it came to where she sat. Sometime around October that had ceased to be a question. She looked at the mountain. He looked at it too. "You got a letter you haven't mentioned," she said. He glanced at her. "How did you know?" "Because you've been sitting with your hands very still, which you only do when you're working something over." She looked at the stars appearing above the peaks. "Is it bad?" 40%. She was quiet for a moment. 60% chance we lose the land." Yes. She looked at the mountain for a long time. The snow on the high slopes caught the starlight and gave it back in a faint blue-white that made the peaks look like they were lit from inside. "When my doctor told me 1 to 2 years," she said, "the first thing I thought was, that's a very long time. Actually, if you use it right." She pulled the blanket closer. 60% chance of losing the land, 40% chance of keeping it. I would rather have 40% of something real than 100% of the careful, small life I was living before. He looked at her. "We file," she said. "We fight it. And when the baby comes, the baby is born here on this land in this cabin under this mountain." She met his gaze. "Whatever happens after that, it happens to people who fought for what they wanted instead of moving out of the way because it was easier." He held her gaze for a long moment. "The baby could be early," he said. "With your heart the pressure of the last weeks. It could come before the lawyer is ready. Babies have historically been unconcerned with legal schedules." The corner of his mouth moved. He looked at the mountain. She looked at the mountain. The creek ran in the dark below them, and somewhere in the pines something moved and was still, and the night held them both in the cold and the starlight and the quiet that had become over the course of this year something neither of them would have known how to live without. Narrator. 2 nights later the wind changed. Jed stood outside at the end of the day and read the sky the way he had read it for 10 years on that mountain. He came inside and without a word began to check the roof, the shutters, the water containers, the firewood. He moved through the cabin with the quiet thoroughness of a man who has made his preparations so many times they no longer require thought. Daphne watched him from the rocking chair. She had felt something different since morning. Low and persistent, settled in her lower back, patient and unhurried the way certain inevitabilities are patient and unhurried. She had not said anything yet. She was waiting for the right moment. Outside, the first flakes of what would become the largest storm of the year were beginning to fall. The storm came in the way Jed had known it would, not gradually, not with the polite warning of darkening skies and shifting wind that gave a man time to prepare and make his peace. It came the way the worst ones always come on that mountain, with a sudden drop in pressure that you felt in your ears before you saw anything, followed almost immediately by the wind and then the snow, and then the understanding that whatever you had planned for the next 12 hours was no longer relevant. He had been watching the signs for 2 days. The birds had known first. The mountain chickadees disappeared from her feeder on Tuesday morning, and when the birds went quiet on that mountain, it meant something was moving in from the northwest that they wanted no part of. The light on Tuesday afternoon had a specific quality, flat and directionless. The sun smothered behind cloud cover so uniform it looked like the sky had been painted with a single stroke. The temperature dropped 9 degrees between 3 in the afternoon and sundown. On Wednesday morning he got up before first light and stood outside in the dark and listened. The mountain was completely silent. Not the living silence he had taught her to love, something else. The silence of held breath, the silence of everything that knew how to survive, having already made its decision and gotten somewhere safe. He came inside and began to prepare. He moved through the cabin with deliberate efficiency, not hurrying, not wasting motion. He checked the roof one more time, pulling on every timber he could reach from inside the loft space, testing every joint. Solid. He brought in firewood until the stack in the main room was as high as the ceiling would allow. He filled every pot, every bucket, every container that would hold water. He checked the shutters. He checked the door hinges. He made sure the medical kit he had assembled over the fall, the clean cloths, the thread, the small sharp knife, the herbs that Bessa Ironwood had sent up through Clovis in November, was within easy reach on the shelf above the stove. He made sure of that last item twice. Daphne watched him from the rocking chair with her hands folded in her lap and said nothing. She had been watching him prepare for 2 days. She had not mentioned what she had been feeling since yesterday morning, the low patient pressure in her back, the tightening that came and went on its own schedule, unhurried building by degrees. She was not ready to name it yet. She was waiting to be certain before she introduced certainty into the room. By noon on Wednesday, the snow had started. By 2 in the afternoon, the trail down to Crow's Bend was gone. He built the signal fire at dusk. On the high boulder at the eastern edge of the clearing, the one that caught the line of sight down the valley to the Redden place where Clovis kept a window burning on nights when he expected word from the mountain. 3 fires in a triangle, the signal they had worked out years ago for emergencies. He built them and lit them in the howling dark, the snow coming sideways by then, and stood long enough to make sure the flames caught and held before the wind tore at them. He did not know if Clovis would see them through the storm. He went back inside. Daphne was not in the rocking chair. She was standing at the foot of the loft ladder, one hand on the lowest rung, her head bowed slightly. She was very still in the way a person is still when they are managing something that requires concentration. He crossed the room, stopped beside her. She didn't look up immediately. "How long?" he said. "Since yesterday morning." She lifted her head then. Her face was composed but pale, the particular pale of someone who has been expending energy invisibly for a while. "I wanted to be certain before I said anything." "Are you certain now?" "Yes." A small pause. "I'm sorry about the timing." He looked at her for a moment. "Don't apologize for the timing." "The storm." "Don't apologize for the timing," he said again, quiet and absolute. She looked at him. He held her gaze. And something in the steadiness of him, the complete and total absence of panic in those dark eyes, the stillness of the man that had taken her weeks to understand, but that she understood fully now, settled into her chest like a warm hand. "All right," she said. "Can you get upstairs?" "Yes, I'd rather be in the bed." He helped her up the ladder, not taking her weight, just there beside her, one hand on the rail, below her hand moving when she moved. She got to the top and moved to the bed and sat down on the edge of it. He was right behind her. "Clovis won't make it up in this," she said. "No. So it's going to be us?" "Yes." She looked at him sitting on the edge of the bed beside her. "Have you ever done this?" "No." Straightforward, no qualification. "Have you?" "I've read about it." "So have I." Something crossed her face, not quite a smile, but in the neighborhood of one. "We make a formidable team, Mr. Cain." "We do," he said, and meant it. The night that followed was the longest of both their lives. Not because it was dangerous in every minute. There were stretches of relative quiet, the contractions building and releasing, and between them a suspended stillness, where she lay back against the pillows and breathed slowly, and he sat beside her doing whatever needed doing, keeping the small stove in the loft burning, keeping the water heated, keeping his hands clean and the cloths ready and his voice steady. He talked to her. Not much, and not about important things. About the mountain. About what the snow sounded like on the roof. About the Clark's nutcracker he had seen at her feeder in early October, which was unusual for that species at that altitude. About the particular way the creek changed its sound in winter, lower and more deliberate, the water moving slower under its skin of ice. She listened to him talk and said little, conserving what she had, which was still considerable. She directed him with the calm authority of someone who had thought carefully about this moment and was not about to let panic make decisions. She told him what to watch for. She told him what was normal and what was not. She told him when he was in the right place and when he needed to move his hands differently. He followed her instructions with the focused precision of a man who is afraid of exactly one thing in the world right now and has decided that fear is not going to be given a vote. 3 hours in, 4 hours in. The storm screaming outside. The small stove in the loft keeping the cold back. The lamplight steady and amber. 5 hours. It was in the 6th hour that she went away from him. Not with warning, not with drama. In the middle of a contraction, a long one harder than the ones before, her body simply stopped responding. Her eyes closed. Her hand in his went slack. He said her name. Not Mrs. Cain. Not Miss Rixley. Not the careful managed distance of any name he had ever used for her before. He said Daphne. Just her name. 2 syllables. his voice entirely stripped of everything he had spent 5 years building between himself and the world, all the control, all the careful management, all the deliberate absence of need. Gone. In that single word. Just her name said in the voice of a man who has discovered at the exact worst moment exactly how much he has to lose. The room was very still. Then she drew a breath. Her eyes opened. She looked at him. He was still holding her hand. She could feel his grip, not careful now, not measured, but real and strong and shaking the smallest amount. "I'm still here," she said. Her voice was hoarse and quiet. "I know." His was almost steady. "You called me Daphne." A pause. "Yes." She looked at him, at the expression on his face that he had entirely stopped trying to manage. "Say it again," she said. He looked at her. "Daphne." She tightened her hand in his, looked at the ceiling, gathered herself. "All right," she said. "Let's finish this." The baby arrived in the deepest hour of the night when the storm was at its worst, and the world outside had reduced itself to wind and white, and the sound of the mountain doing what mountains do, asserting indifferently and completely its own terms. He came into the world with a voice that had absolutely no interest in being quiet about it. The first cry hit the room like something physical, loud and furious and entirely undeniably alive, a sound that cut through the storm and the dark, and every wall Jedodiah Cain had ever built inside himself and went straight through to something he had believed for 5 years was no longer accessible. Jed caught the baby in his hands. He held him there wet and small and violently indignant about his recent arrival, his face scrunched and red, his hands already in fists, already arguing with the world. And Jedodiah Cain did not look at him right away. He looked at his own hands first. These hands. That had signed 17 survey reports, that had fired a rifle in the dark in Virginia and in Montana and God knew where else in between, that had spent 5 years on this mountain doing exactly enough and nothing more. He looked at his own hands holding this small, furious living thing, and then he looked at the baby. In that moment, just for a second, behind his eyes where no one would have been able to see it, he was somewhere else. He was 23 years old, before the war, before everything. Sitting on the porch of his father's house in Ohio on a September evening watching the last light come through the trees. His mother was inside. He could hear her moving the small domestic sounds of a house that was alive. The kitchen window glowed, the smell of wood smoke and supper. He had thought sitting on that porch in that particular light that this was what he wanted. Not the specific house or the specific light, but the quality of it. The warmth inside when the night was coming cold. The sense of something that mattered going on inside the walls. He had wanted that. He had always wanted that. He had simply spent the years since then convincing himself that wanting it was a weakness he could not afford. He came back to the loft. The lamp. The storm. The baby in his hands still crying a strong, clear, demanding cry that filled the small space under the roof and left room for nothing else. Jed Cain had not cried since the winter of 1879. He had made a decision then, standing in a cold room in Denver, that he was done with crying, that it served no purpose, that the world didn't owe him the comfort of it. He had kept that decision for 5 years. He did not keep it now, not loudly, not with any kind of collapse or performance. Just 2 lines of tears moving down his face in the amber light, slow and honest, while he held his son in his hands and looked at the small, furious face that was already absurdly, undeniably beginning to look familiar. Daphne said nothing. She was watching him. Her face was exhausted and pale and more beautiful than he had words for. He brought the baby to her, laid him against her chest. She looked down at the small face. The baby stopped crying. He looked up at her, at this new world, at this first face, at the warm presence that he recognized in the way newborns recognize the one voice they have been hearing from the inside. He studied her with dark, serious eyes that were already remarkably like his father's. "Hello," she said softly. "You certainly know how to make an entrance." Jed sat back, put his hands on his knees, breathed. Outside, the storm continued its vast and furious conversation with the mountain, and inside the loft, in the amber light of a single lamp, the three of them existed in the particular silence that follows the most important moments, the silence that is not empty, but full of everything that has just happened and everything that is now irreversibly true. He went downstairs at some point, she wasn't sure exactly when. She heard him moving below, the sounds of the cabin doing what it did. Water heated, the main fire built high, the particular quiet competence of a man in his own space doing what needed doing. He came back up with hot water and clean cloth, and the careful, methodical attention of someone who has decided that care is the one language he knows how to speak fluently. She let him. She was tired in a way that went to the bone, and she was not too proud to accept what was offered. He cleaned his hands. He cleaned hers. He checked the baby with a thoroughness that would have been impressive in a doctor. Fingers counted toes, counted the small chest, rising and falling, observed for long enough to be certain. He said nothing during any of this. His face was the face of a man doing the most important work of his life, and knowing it. When he was satisfied, he sat on the edge of the bed. She was nursing the baby, who had moved from fury to focused purpose with the pragmatism of the newly born. "He needs a name," she said. Jed looked at the baby. "Yes. I want to call him Clovis." He looked up at her. Something moved behind his eyes. "That's a heavy name for a new person." "Old Clovis has carried heavy things his whole life," she said. "This one can carry a name." She looked down at the baby. "Clovis Cain. It sounds like someone worth knowing." He said it quietly, testing it. "Clovis Cain." He looked at the baby's face, looked at it for a long time. "It fits," he said. "Good." She shifted carefully, settling back against the pillows. "Because I wasn't going to negotiate on it." He looked at her. The corner of his mouth moved. "I know." She slept. He sat beside her in the loft while the storm moved through the last of its fury overhead, and he watched her breathe, and he watched the baby breathe, and the lamp burned low, and he turned it up and watched them both. He was not afraid. He had been afraid earlier when she had gone away from him in the 6th hour, when her hand went slack, when the room had gone very still in a way that had nothing gentle in it. That fear had been the most complete thing he had felt in years, clean and cold and total. But she had come back. She had said, "I'm still here," and she had meant it with every ounce of the stubbornness that had carried her 2,000 miles and up a mountain and through a year that would have folded a lesser person in half. She was still here. He sat and watched them both breathe, and the storm passed, and the night passed, and when the first gray light of morning came through the east window of the loft, it found the three of them exactly as they were present, alive together in the small, warm space under the roof of the cabin that Jed Cain had built to last. Clovis made it up by mid-morning. He came with Tobin behind him, both of them on horseback, the trail having been beaten open enough by the retreating storm to allow it if you were determined, and the horse was willing. Clovis's gray mule was always willing. It had been up and down that mountain in worse conditions than this, and had opinions about it that it kept to itself. Jed met them at the gate. Clovis looked at his face, read it the way the old man read everything, quietly, thoroughly, missing nothing. Then he pulled his hat brim up and looked at the cabin. "Both of them," he said. "Not a question. Both of them." Clovis exhaled through his nose, long and slow. He looked at the sky, at the mountain, at the snow covering everything in the kind of clean white that follows the worst storms, as if the world has decided to start again from scratch. "Boy or girl?" he said. "Boy." Tobin behind him made a sound that was something between a laugh and a whoop, and converted it quickly into a cough when Clovis looked at him. They went inside. She was awake when they came up the ladder, propped against the pillows with the baby in the crook of her arm. The color coming back into her face in the particular incremental way that follows the all-night effort of surviving something that demanded everything. Clovis took off his hat at the top of the ladder. He stood at the edge of the loft, looking at her and at the baby with the expression of a man who has waited a long time for a thing and is now looking directly at it. "Miss Daphne," he said. "Mr. Redden." Her voice was hoarse and warm. "Come and meet someone." The old man crossed the loft. He stood beside the bed and looked down at the baby who was awake and looking back at him with the dark-eyed intensity that seemed to be a Cain family characteristic. "Lord," Clovis said quietly, "would you look at that?" "We named him Clovis," Jed said from the doorway. The old man went very still. He looked at Jed, then at Daphne, then back at the baby. His jaw worked once. He put one large, rough hand over his mouth briefly, the way a man does when he needs a moment that he would rather not give the room a view of. Then he lowered his hand, cleared his throat. "That's a terrible thing to do to a child," he said, his voice steady, the eyes above it not quite as steady. "He can handle it," Daphne said. "He'll have to." Clovis stood there a moment longer. Then he looked at Jed in the doorway. "May I?" Jed nodded. The old man sat on the edge of the bed. He held out his hands, big and calloused and scarred by 67 years of hard use, and Daphne placed the baby in them with the careful transfer of someone who has already decided this person can be trusted. Clovis held the baby. He didn't say anything. He just held him, looking at the small face with those tired brown eyes, and whatever was moving through the old man in those moments, he kept to himself. It was not Jed's to know, and it was not Daphne's to know. It was Clovis Redden's, earned by 67 years of a life that had included everything a life on this frontier could include: loss and displacement, and the specific grief of a man who had outlived the things he loved, and the baby in his arms was not any of those things. The baby was something else. After a long moment the baby made a sound, not crying, just a small declarative sound, as if he was informing the room of his continued presence and expected acknowledgement. Clovis laughed. A real laugh, quiet and surprised and entirely unguarded. He handed the baby back to Daphne. He stood up. He looked at Jed. Neither of them said anything. Jed held his gaze and gave a small nod. Clovis gave a small nod back. That was the whole of it, and it was entirely enough. Tobin appeared at the top of the ladder, holding a pot of something that smelled like beef and onion produced from his saddlebag, with the cheerful resourcefulness of a young man who had correctly anticipated that people who had been up all night delivering a baby during a blizzard would be hungry. "From Clovis's kitchen," he announced. "He made it yesterday when he saw the signal fire." Daphne looked at the pot. Her eyes went briefly bright. "I could love that man," she said. "You could get in line," Jed said. Tobin looked between them and appeared to be trying to determine whether that had been a joke. He decided wisely not to commit to an interpretation. He set the pot on the small stove and descended the ladder to give them space. They ate, all three of them, Clovis included, in the small warm loft with the storm-cleaned mountain outside the east window, and the baby sleeping in the crook of Daphne's arm, and the smell of beef stew and wood smoke and cold air that had been brought in on 4 coats filling the space under the rafters. Nobody said anything particularly significant. They talked about the storm, about the trail, about the gray mule's opinion of the conditions, about whether the creek would ice over completely by March or hold its center channel the way it sometimes did. It was in every outward respect an ordinary conversation, but there was nothing ordinary about any of it, and all 4 of them knew it, and none of them felt the need to say so. It was late afternoon when Clovis and Tobin went down the mountain. Clovis paused at the door. He looked at Jed standing in the main room at the cabin that had the particular lived-in quality of a place that has been through something and come out the other side of it. He looked at the rocking chair by the east window, at the 2 rows of books on the shelf Jed had built in November, at the small carved figures on the mantelpiece that Jed had made over the winter without calling them gifts and left in locations where she would find them. "You did good," Clovis said. He was not talking about the night before, or not only about it. Jed looked at him. "We're not out of trouble yet. The land—" "I know about the land." The old man picked up his hat. "I'm not talking about the land." He put the hat on, looked at Jed one more time. "You did good." He went out. Tobin followed, offering a general cheerful farewell to the room at large. The door closed. The cabin was quiet. Jed stood in the main room for a moment. He could hear Daphne upstairs, the small sounds of a woman settling a sleeping baby, the sound of the rocking chair that he had moved to the loft at some point in the fall when she had mentioned in passing that the mornings were best up there in the light, and he had moved it without discussing it because there was nothing to discuss. He went to the bookshelf on the east wall. He moved it. He took up the 3 boards. He reached into the space beneath and took out the cloth-wrapped box and held it in both hands. It was lighter than he remembered. Or maybe he was stronger now. It was sometimes hard to tell the difference. He carried it upstairs. She was in the rocking chair. The baby was asleep in the small wooden cradle he had made in October. The cradle he had told her was for storage when she asked about it, and that she had looked at with an expression that said she knew exactly what it was for and found his deflection affectionate rather than convincing. The east window held the last of the afternoon light. Pink and gold, the particular extravagance that the sky produced over those peaks on clear days after a big storm, as if it were making a point. He stood at the top of the ladder with the box in his hands. She looked at him, at the box, back at him. He crossed the loft, sat on the edge of the bed, set the box on his knee. She stopped rocking. She waited. He held the box for a moment. Then he took the small key from his coat pocket, the key he had carried on his person every day for 5 years on the same ring as his knife sharpener and his compass close enough to touch whenever he needed to remember why he couldn't afford to want things, and he opened the lock. He lifted the lid. Inside, nested in a small square of cloth, were a pair of shoes. Baby shoes. Soft leather, the kind made for feet that had not yet learned to walk. Small enough to sit in the palm of one hand. The leather was still supple, kept in the cool, dry dark under the floor they had lasted. The stitching around the soles was careful, unhurried work. Someone had made them, or had them made, with the kind of attention you give to something for a person who is coming. They were new. They had never been worn. Daphne looked at them for a long time. Then she looked at Jed. His face was open in the way his face was rarely open. Not broken, not raw, but simply present. All the doors that he kept closed were standing open right now, not because they had been forced, but because he had opened them himself deliberately one by one over the course of a year, and this was what was behind them. Not ruin, not the darkness he had been guarding against. Just a man sitting on the edge of a bed in a loft in the mountains, holding a box with a pair of small shoes in it, looking at the woman who had climbed up a mountain to find him and had refused to leave. She reached out. He placed the shoes in her hands. She held them, looked at them carefully the way she looked at everything, not glancingly but fully giving it the attention it deserved. The stitching, the soft sole, the small brass eyelet at the top of each one where a ribbon would have gone. She turned one over in her hands. Then she looked at Jed. Her name was Anna. Yes. She nodded, looked at the shoes once more. Then she stood up from the rocking chair slowly, carefully, the way she moved now, and walked to the mantelpiece. On the mantelpiece beside the stove there was a small wool cap. She had knitted it in January from the best yarn Clovis had brought up on his last supply run, blue-gray, the color of the mountain sky in early morning. She had knitted it at the window over several evenings, and Jed had watched without asking what it was for because he knew what it was for. She set Anna's shoes on the mantelpiece. She set them beside the wool cap. She stepped back and looked at both of them. The shoes that had been made for the child who never came. The cap that had been made for the child who had. 2 small things side by side in the lamplight. Not the same story. Not canceling each other out. Not one replacing the other. Just 2 things that were both true, existing in the same space the way true things do when you stop trying to make them into something tidier than they are. Jed stood behind her and looked at the mantelpiece. She did not say anything. Neither did he. After a long moment he came to stand beside her. They looked at the 2 small objects in the light. He put his arm around her shoulders. She leaned into him the small amount that she needed to, and no more, because she was still herself, still upright, still the woman who had climbed a mountain on her own and would walk back down it when the time came. But she leaned, and he held. The baby made a sound in the cradle, the small declarative sound he had made earlier, informing the room that he was present and expected acknowledgement. They both turned to look at him. His eyes were open. He was looking at the ceiling with an expression of grave philosophical interest. "He's going to be opinionated," she said. "Probably. He gets it from you. He gets it from you." A pause. Then she laughed, quiet, tired, entirely genuine, and he stood beside her in the lamplight of the loft with his arm around her shoulders and listened to her laugh and did not say anything at all, because there was nothing to say that was better than this. "Now, here is where I have to be careful, because this is the part where a lesser story would tie everything up with a bow, would give you the court ruling and the land kept, and the doctor proven wrong and the villain run out of the territory and the hero and his wife living to a comfortable old age, surrounded by grandchildren, and the particular well-earned satisfaction of people who fought for something and won completely. Real stories don't work that way. This one doesn't either. What I can tell you is what I know. The land case went to the territorial court in Helena in the fall of 1883. The lawyer argued the habitation claim, the improvements claim, and the birth claim, young Clovis Cain having arrived on the property in March of that year, which the statute did in fact recognize. Eleanor Voss submitted a written statement to the court. Clovis Redden testified in person, traveling to Helena on his gray mule and wearing his best hat, which he had owned since approximately 1861, and which still looked better than most men's everyday hats. The ruling came down in November. They kept the cabin, the clearing, the ponderosa pines on the near slope, the creek and the 300 yards on either side of it, the high boulder at the eastern edge of the clearing where Jed had built his signal fires. The western timber holdings, perhaps a third of what Jed had been using as trapline range for a decade, those went to the company. He did not appeal. When Clovis asked him why he said what he had said before, he didn't need the whole mountain. He needed enough land for the cabin to stand on. Enough, it turned out, was what he had. Wade Collier came through Crow's Bend one more time the following spring. He was passing through on his way to somewhere else. Another parcel, another negotiation, another legal enough acquisition in a territory that was running out of unclaimed things. He stopped at the general store. He stood outside for a moment in the warm May air and looked up at the mountain. Tobin Larimore was sitting on the bench outside the store and saw him do it. The man stood there for maybe a minute, looking up at the peaks, at nothing in particular or at everything in general. Then he went inside, bought his supplies, and rode on. He never came back. As for Daphne, people asked me that. People always ask me that first. And what I told them then is what I'll tell you now. The doctor in Philadelphia had said 1 to 2 years. He had said it with the confidence of a man who had looked at enough hearts to know the pattern, and he was not wrong about the pattern. What he did not account for could not have accounted for, because this is not the kind of thing that shows up in a doctor's calculations, was the particular stubbornness of a woman who had decided on a cold night in a train station in Philadelphia that she was going to live her remaining time in full rather than in careful increments. She lived past the first year. She lived past the second. Some days were hard. Some weeks were harder. There were nights on that mountain when Jed held her while her body ran its difficult argument with itself, and the sound of the wind in the pines was the only sound, besides his voice low and steady, talking her through it the way he had talked her through the longest night. She didn't always win those nights cleanly, but she got through them. Young Clovis Cain grew up on that mountain with his father's dark eyes and his mother's habit of looking at things fully before she decided what to do about them. He learned to walk on the same pine plank floors where his parents had first measured the careful distance between two people who needed each other and hadn't yet found the language for it. He learned the names of the birds, all of them. Clovis Redden visited every week until his legs made the climb too difficult, and then he sent Tobin up with supplies and came himself when the weather was right and the gray mule felt cooperative. He never stopped calling her Miss Daphne, and he never stopped bringing her books which he found in various towns and catalogs and occasionally had imported from back east with a specificity of selection that suggested he had put real thought into it. He did not talk much about the past. Neither did Jed. They had arrived by some unspoken agreement at the same place regarding the past. It had happened, it had cost them things, it had shaped what they were, and it was no longer the most important thing in the room. The most important thing in the room was whatever was happening now. That was in the end what Daphne had come up the mountain to teach them both. Not by explaining it, not by arguing for it, simply by being a person who lived that way completely and without apology and making it impossible to share a space with her without learning something from it. Bessa Ironwood never came up the mountain. She never needed to. She knew what she knew, and she sent what she sent, and she trusted the mountain to do the rest of the work. On the 3 occasions that Daphne came down to town in the first summer, the second summer, and the summer after the court ruling, she found a small package waiting for her at the general store. No note, no sender's name. The smell of it told her everything she needed to know. She brought the packages home. She used them. She did not ask questions. When Bessa Ironwood died in the winter of 1885, Daphne came down to town for the service. She was the only person there who was not from the tribe, and the only person there who fully understood what she had lost, which was the same thing she had been given a watchfulness that asked for nothing in return. And Jed. People always asked about Jed last as if they expected the least from him and were accustomed to being right about that. Here is what I know about Jedodiah Cain. He woke up every morning for the rest of his life on that mountain before first light. He made coffee the way he always had, dark and uncompromising, the kind that tasted like a decision. He stood at the kitchen window in the early gray and looked at the mountain. That part did not change. What changed was what he was looking at. Before Daphne, he stood at that window looking at something that confirmed what he already believed about himself, that the mountain was the right size for the life he deserved, that the silence was appropriate, that the distance between himself and everything warm and human was exactly the distance he had earned. After he stood at that window, looking at something else entirely. The aspens on the near slope turning with the seasons, the first birds at the feeder his wife had built and maintained, and eventually handed over to their son, who took the responsibility with characteristic seriousness. The smoke from the chimney when the fire was going, rising straight up in still air and bending east in wind, telling him the direction of the day before he had to go out and find it himself. He stood there every morning. He looked at all of it. And then he went back to the table where the coffee was waiting, and the boy was beginning to wake, and the woman who had come up his mountain and refused to leave was in the rocking chair by the east window with a book and the particular quality of presence that she had, warm and clear and entirely itself, filling the room from corner to corner the way good light fills a room, leaving nothing in shadow. The shoes stayed on the mantelpiece. The wool cap eventually moved. Young Clovis wore it through his second winter and his third until it no longer fit, and was replaced by progressively larger versions, each one stored carefully in the chest at the foot of the loft bed. But the shoes stayed where they were, on the left side of the mantelpiece beside the lamp, small and still and permanent. Nobody ever moved them. Nobody needed to explain why. I asked Jed once years later on a fall afternoon when we were sitting on that porch with the aspens doing their gold thing on the near slope, and the boy somewhere in the trees learning to track the way his father had taught him, I asked what he thought the day she stepped off the stagecoach. What he had actually thought, not the story about it, but the real thing underneath. He was quiet for a long time. The aspens moved. The mountain stood. I thought she'd be gone in a week, he said, and when she wasn't. He looked at the mountain. I thought she'd be gone in a month. And when she wasn't. A pause. Then I stopped thinking about when she'd be gone. He looked at the porch rail, at his hands on it, and started thinking about other things. What other things? He looked at me then. The look of a man who has spent a long time learning to say true things out loud and has not yet decided whether this one belongs to him or to the open air. Whether I still had it in me, he said, to be someone worth staying for. I didn't say anything. You don't fill that kind of silence with words. After a while he stood up, went inside. I heard him say something to Daphne in the kitchen, quiet. Ordinary, the sound of two people who have been talking to each other long enough that the conversation doesn't need volume to carry weight. I heard her answer. I heard the sound of the rocking chair. I sat on that porch in the fall light and listened to the aspens and the creek in the distance and the boy somewhere in the trees, learning the mountain, the way the mountain teaches the people who are patient enough to let it slowly, completely, without mercy and without indifference, teaching you exactly what you need to know for exactly as long as you are willing to pay attention. People say a lot of things about Jedodiah Cain. Some of them are true. Some of them are the comfortable kind of story that towns tell about people they never quite understood and are not entirely sure they deserved. But here is what they never say. What they don't know to say because they weren't there and they didn't see it. They don't say that every evening without exception, for as long as I knew him, Jedodiah Cain stopped whatever he was doing when the light began to go. Stopped and looked toward the cabin. Not because he feared something was wrong. Not out of habit or duty or any of the practical reasons a man looks toward his house. He looked because he wanted to. Because the smoke from the chimney and the lamplight in the east window and the small sound of voices inside these things had not become ordinary to him, the way they become ordinary to people who have always had them. They had remained every single evening, exactly what they were the first time he understood what they meant to him. Everything. The whole improbable, hard-won, undeserved everything. He would stand there looking for a moment, then he would go inside. That was the story. That is the story I know. You've heard it now. So have the mountains.